Sunny Hillside Village might have seemed like an ordinary suburban development from the outside. Identical mailboxes, cookie-cutter houses, neatly trimmed lawns. But behind those uniform facades was a tapestry of personalities, hopes, and hidden tensions. The community was governed by a well-established homeowners association, HOA, that prided itself on keeping things orderly. On the southeastern edge of Sunny Hillside Village stood a pale yellow two-story home with a gentle slope leading to the sidewalk. In front of that house was a sturdy wheelchair ramp, carefully constructed of treated lumber and steel rails, with a corrugated surface for traction. Every day, a 46-year-old resident named Ethan Chambers used that ramp to enter and exit his home. Ethan had been in a car accident 3 years earlier. Complications left him reliant on a wheelchair for mobility. He had adapted admirably, continuing his work from home as a legal researcher, assisted by specialized software. His sense of humor and resilience kept him going, despite lingering aches and the daily struggles of adapting a non-wheelchair-friendly suburb to his needs. Not everyone appreciated the ramp, however. A few neighbors thought it looked industrial. Others were worried that ramp construction signaled a wave of unsightly modifications to come. Yet they mostly kept quiet. After all, Ethan was well-liked and always kind, waving to neighbors from the foot of the ramp. He sometimes handed out homemade cookies during the holidays, so no one really wanted to upset him. At least, not until Karen got involved. Her real name was Brenda Arwood, though you would seldom hear anyone call her that. Around Sunny Hillside Village, people whispered the nickname Karen whenever she passed by, pressing an iPad close to her chest. Karen was a woman in her early 50s with meticulously dyed auburn hair that was stiff with hairspray. A staunch believer in the covenant of the HOA, she walked the streets with an air of self-importance. She acted as if every inch of sidewalk and every blade of grass were her personal responsibility to monitor. Karen had served on the HOA board for 5 years. She was famously strict, sometimes penning 10 or more notice of violation letters in a single afternoon. She once scolded a neighbor's teenage son for leaning his bicycle against a lamppost for 10 minutes. Another time, she chastised a new family who placed a bright gnome in their front yard. Karen's entire identity seemed built upon maintaining what she deemed the aesthetic integrity of Sunny Hillside Village. In truth, the rest of the HOA board found Karen overbearing. Still, her dedication was unparalleled, and many members were reluctant to confront her too forcefully. She seemed to thrive on any confrontation that allowed her to recite the official rulebook. When Ethan first installed his wheelchair ramp, Karen had scoured the community guidelines for something to challenge it. She discovered no direct rule forbidding ramps for medical necessities. Most states had strong legal protections ensuring disabled residents could modify their homes for access. Still, Karen found the ramp's presence unsightly and felt it clashed with the uniform exteriors of Sunny Hillside Village. She believed the ramp would set a precedent, allowing everyone to make structural changes without thoroughly consulting the HOA board. At an HOA meeting 2 weeks after Ethan's ramp was completed, Karen brought up the subject. "We have to preserve the high property values here. A large wooden ramp in front of home is not in line with our community standards," she declared, brandishing a printout of a phone photo she had snapped. Henry Delacroix, a longtime board member, countered gently. "Karen, we can't stop someone from installing a wheelchair ramp if it's medically necessary. That's outside our authority, and it's also ethically questionable. Federal and state laws protect these modifications." Karen's lip curled in frustration. She retorted with something about making the ramp look more tasteful. But she saw she was outnumbered. Nobody else on the board wanted to approach Ethan or force him to dismantle the ramp. With her usual pout, Karen dropped the matter publicly, but a spark of resentment formed in her eyes. Over the months that followed, Karen would walk by Ethan's place nearly every day. She'd slow down and glare at the ramp, as if it were an affront to her sense of decorum. Some neighbors overheard her muttering about how Ethan should have at least painted it to match the house or built it out back. Others saw her tap the ramp's handrail, checking if it had been properly installed. But with no real basis for complaint, she had to let it be. Ethan had no idea how deeply his ramp irked Karen. He was too busy going about his life. He had good days and bad days, physically. On days his pain was worse. He felt grateful he didn't have to struggle with stairs. The ramp was a lifeline. It symbolized mobility, freedom, and independence. When he wheeled down in the morning to greet the day, he felt empowered. The last thing he expected was that someone would try to sabotage it. In Karen's mind, that ramp had become a symbol of everything she despised about changes that were beyond her control. She was the type of person who believed that if the HOA allowed one visually disruptive structure, soon there would be a tidal wave of non-compliant additions. Elaborate fences, cheap garden statues, solar panels glinting in the sun, anything she deemed tacky. She wanted to prove that a ramp in front of a home was not just an inconvenience to her sense of style, but also a hazard. One late afternoon, Karen was in her home office, feeding pages of junk mail and old HOA documents through a heavy-duty shredder. As she watched the narrow confetti-like strips collect in the bin, a strange idea took shape. What if, she reasoned, the ramp could be shown to be unsafe due to poor maintenance or slippery conditions? Maybe that would put pressure on Ethan to remove it or relocate it. Shredded paper, Karen thought, could cause a surface to become dangerously slick when wet or compacted. She'd read that certain substrates, when combined with moisture, clump into a slippery pulp. If she discreetly spread enough shredded paper over the ramp, it might cause a minor incident, or at least enough of a scare to prove it was a safety hazard. Then, the HOA would have grounds to demand modifications. To Karen's twisted logic, the end, preserving the neighborhood's look, justified the means. Days later, in the pre-dawn silence, Karen set her plan in motion. She donned dark clothes and a cap that she pulled low over her brow. From the trunk of her compact SUV, she lifted a large plastic bag filled with shredded paper. It was surprisingly heavy. She had saved up multiple shredder bins worth. There was no one around at this hour. Street lights flickered weakly, and occasional crickets chirped in the hedges. Quietly, she stepped onto the sidewalk outside Ethan's house. A surge of adrenaline coursed through her. She kept glancing around, certain that if a neighbor came outside with a dog or turned on a porch light, she'd be caught. But that morning was eerily calm. She crept up the shallow ramp, kneeling to spread layer after layer of shredded paper along each segment of the corrugated flooring. She was methodical, pressing the strips into corners and edges, hoping that even a breeze wouldn't scatter them away before Ethan tried to use the ramp. Her idea of sabotage was to create an uneven, slippery surface that might jam the ramp's traction. She told herself, "I'm not trying to hurt him, just to show that the ramp is poorly maintained." But a small, guilty voice in her head whispered that she was crossing a moral line, jeopardizing a man who already faced mobility challenges. She silenced that voice. After distributing the shredded paper, Karen scurried back to her car. She felt an odd combination of exhilaration and dread. Before starting the engine, she peeked once more at Ethan's house. The ramp looked like it was covered in confetti from a distance. Then she drove off, determined to keep her act hidden. She hoped the next day would bring an outcry about the hazard. When morning arrived, Ethan woke to mild aches in his lower back. He performed his usual routine, a set of gentle stretches in bed, followed by a transfer into his wheelchair with practiced ease. The house was quiet, as he lived alone. He headed toward the front door, eager to get some fresh air before diving into a stack of online legal briefs. Through the small window, he spotted something unusual on the ramp, a scattering of white bits. At first, he thought maybe a strong wind had blown trash from a recycling bin. But when he opened the door and looked more closely, his eyes widened in surprise. The entire ramp surface was covered in crisscrossing strips of shredded paper. It almost looked like a bizarre art installation. Puzzled, he rolled forward to investigate. He noticed how some of the paper was wedged into the grooves designed to provide traction. Ethan frowned. He tested the ramp with one gloved hand. The strips slid under his palm. If the morning dew made them soggy, this would be a slippery mess. Already, certain spots felt precarious. A chill raced down his spine. If he hadn't noticed, he might have rolled right onto that surface and risked a nasty slip. Or worse, a fall that could break bones he couldn't afford to injure. Grimacing, Ethan braced his wheelchair at the top of the ramp, trying to push some of the paper aside. It bunched up in lumps that clogged the shallow treads. Each attempt to clear was painstakingly slow, and bits clung to his gloves. He realized he'd need help. This was more than a quick cleanup job. Deciding to remove at least the top layer, Ethan carefully wheeled onto the ramp, going slowly. With the slightest motion of his chair, the strips scattered beneath his wheels. A portion of the ramp felt slightly damp from overnight condensation. His chair's caster squeaked. Suddenly, the front wheels lost traction for a moment, skidding half an inch. That half-inch slip felt like a mile to Ethan. His stomach lurched with dread, imagining the tumble that could follow if the ramp angle grew steeper. Heart pounding, he slammed the wheel locks to keep from rolling uncontrollably. It was the closest he'd come to a ramp-related accident in months. When the wheels stabilized, he managed to back up the ramp inch by inch, then return to the house. Feeling shaky, Ethan called a neighbor he trusted, Connie Mathers, a retired nurse who lived 2 doors down. Connie arrived in minutes, wearing a light jacket over her pajamas. She took one look at the ramp and exclaimed, "Good grief, who on earth would dump shredded paper here?" She helped Ethan move back inside to be safe, then proceeded to try sweeping the ramp. However, the paper clung to the edges. It threatened to form a pulp if it got any wetter. Connie shook her head, worried about how close Ethan had come to a serious accident. Word traveled quickly along sunny hillside village. Connie, outraged by the sabotage, texted a few neighbors. Within an hour, several people showed up with brooms, shop vacs, and even a leaf blower to help. They worked on the ramp in shifts, carefully vacuuming every nook. Some older residents who adored Ethan pitched in, wanting to ensure the ramp was 100% clear before the day's end. It was a strange sight. A cluster of neighbors in sweatpants and t-shirts, vacuum hoses winding across the lawn, bits of paper swirling in the breeze. They bagged the debris and double-checked the traction panels. Once the ramp was free of the shredded pulp, one man suggested, "We should hose it down and scrub it clean, just to be sure." But Ethan worried about causing more slippery conditions. Ultimately, they used minimal water, then dried the surface with towels. Despite the thorough cleanup, Connie fretted that any residual fibers might remain lodged in the grooves, making the ramp slick over time. "We might need an anti-slip coating," she said. Ethan, though tired, agreed. He realized the ramp had to be safer than ever. Whatever had happened that morning was no accident, in his opinion. It felt deliberate. Karen observed the day's events from a distance. She stayed indoors mostly, only peeking through her blinds to watch the neighborly cleanup. She hadn't expected such a coordinated response, people scurrying around the ramp with vacuums and blowers. Her plan had been to have Ethan slip, or at least see that the ramp became a nuisance. Instead, the fiasco was turning into a communal effort to make the ramp even more functional. By sunset, the ramp was not only clean, but also had a fresh layer of anti-slip treatment that one neighbor had purchased at the hardware store. Someone else, a retired engineer, affixed bright yellow reflective strips along the edges to ensure maximum visibility at night. The final appearance was more conspicuous than before, ironically making the ramp stand out even more in the neighborhood. Karen paced her living room, furious at how the situation had backfired. She worried that if anyone suspected her involvement, she'd face not only the neighbors' fury, but possibly legal consequences. She told herself that no one had proof. She'd planned her sabotage carefully in the dim hours of morning, wearing nondescript clothes. Surely, no cameras had caught her. Sunny Hillside Village wasn't rife with security systems. Still, she felt a knot in her stomach, realizing she might have crossed a line that couldn't be undone. While no one had direct evidence of who'd dumped shredded paper over Ethan's ramp, speculation abounded. People asked, who had a motive? Who disliked the ramp? A few long-time residents quietly recalled that Karen had expressed disapproval of the structure in an HOA meeting. Connie, who had a sharp intuition from decades in nursing, confided her suspicions to Henry Delacroix. Karen was the only one who publicly complained about the ramp, Connie pointed out. Would she really do something so cruel? Henry's face fell. I don't want to accuse anyone without proof. But Karen does have a history of going overboard. Let's tread carefully. Nobody was ready to confront Karen outright, not without something more tangible. However, the seeds of doubt had been planted. Even if some neighbors remained silent, they'd give Karen side glances. A few began checking their own doorbell cameras, hoping to see if any shadowy figure had passed by in the early morning. But Karen had chosen her timing well. Nobody seemed to catch her on video. Ethan, though rattled by the near slip, refused to live in fear. He wanted to respond in a way that upheld the community spirit. So, a few days after the sabotage, he organized a small accessibility awareness cookout at his house. He invited neighbors to come by, share food, and learn about the challenges wheelchair users face in navigating everyday life. He also wanted to thank those who had helped clean the ramp. A couple of large folding tables were set up on Ethan's driveway, laden with homemade sandwiches, fruit trays, and lemonade. The newly bright ramp, with its reflective stripes, was on full display. To lighten the mood, Ethan jokingly hung a sign at the top, "No shredded paper zone." Neighbors laughed about it, while also acknowledging the seriousness of the sabotage. The event drew families, retirees, and even some teenage kids who listened attentively when Ethan spoke about how small obstacles, like a single-door lip, could make or break accessibility. He demonstrated how certain angles and friction levels on a ramp might look trivial to an able-bodied person, but were monumental for someone in a chair. Connie explained some basic safety checks. Always keep surfaces clean, watch for moisture, and make sure no debris accumulates. Many neighbors left with a new perspective on what Ethan and others like him face daily. One of Ethan's goals was to galvanize the HOA to adopt clearer rules protecting accessibility modifications. Henry Delacroix agreed wholeheartedly, believing that the existing guidelines were outdated. At the next HOA meeting, held in the community clubhouse, Henry brought up the notion of drafting accessibility and safety additions to the HOA bylaws. These additions would explicitly state that wheelchair ramps and similar accommodations were not only permitted, but also to be respected and maintained with the HOA's full support. Karen sat stiffly at a table near the front, her face expressionless as Henry spoke. She had half hoped the ramp fiasco would lead to a crackdown on inappropriate structures. Instead, the outcome was the exact opposite. Henry's proposals were well received by most of the board and the residents who attended. They wanted to ensure that something like the shredded paper incident never recurred. To that end, they even discussed forming a small fund to help maintain ramps in the neighborhood. After the meeting, Karen rose to leave without speaking. A couple of neighbors glanced her way, as if waiting for her to chime in, but she merely flashed a tight smile and walked out. Her silence was uncharacteristic for someone who usually had plenty to say. Some in attendance wondered if she felt guilty. Others thought she might be brooding, preparing a new angle of attack. Either way, the seeds of community-driven change had been planted. Over the next few weeks, a low-level tension spread through sunny Hillside Village. Karen stopped her usual habit of morning walks with the iPad, presumably to avoid suspicion. People noticed the blinds in her front window drawn more often. She also took to leaving her house in a hurry, wearing large sunglasses, barely acknowledging neighbors. In casual conversation, residents whispered that they felt uneasy around her. Meanwhile, Ethan carried on, grateful for the new supportive energy from the HOA. The ramp had never been safer, with fresh traction and bright reflective tape. In truth, it was now the shining example of how to incorporate accessibility without sacrificing aesthetics. Several neighbors commented that the ramp actually looked well integrated and professional. Still, Connie and a handful of others remained certain that Karen was behind the sabotage. Without concrete proof, confronting her risked a neighborhood feud. They decided that if Karen escalated matters, they'd be ready. One warm afternoon, a month after the sabotage, Ethan was collecting mail when he spotted Karen across the street. She was standing near the storm drain, adjusting the leash on her small white dog. In a friendly gesture, Ethan waved and called out, "Good afternoon." He believed in second chances and thought maybe bridging the gap was the neighborly thing to do. Karen froze, offered a terse nod, then turned away. Just then, the dog yanked on the leash, and Karen stumbled. She lost her footing on a slight dip in the curb. In her scramble, she dropped a thin binder she had been holding under one arm. Its contents spilled onto the pavement. Loose paper fluttered out. Many of them were half-shredded sheets, as if she'd been feeding them through her shredder, but stopped halfway. Ethan wheeled closer, concerned. "Are you okay?" he asked. Without meeting his eye, Karen snatched up the pages in a frenzy. He glimpsed the shredded edges and recognized the same style of cross-cut texture that had blanketed his ramp. An immediate wave of realization washed over him, but he said nothing, not wanting to escalate the situation on the spot. He watched as Karen, flustered, stuffed the pages back in her binder and marched toward her house, dog in tow. Ethan's heart pounded. He had suspected Karen, but seeing that half-shredded paper was like a punch to the gut, almost a confirmation. He felt anger flare. For a moment, he wanted to demand an apology or ask her how she could do something so cruel. But he knew better than to confront her in the street. He took a deep breath and reminded himself that the community was behind him. When Connie heard about the binder incident, her eyes flashed. "This is the last straw," she declared. "We need to bring it to the HOA's attention." Ethan, however, hesitated. He was a diplomatic soul, worried that direct accusations would polarize the neighborhood. "We still don't have actual proof. She could say it's just a coincidence she had shredded paper." Connie shook her head. "Sometimes you need to confront the bully. If you don't, they'll think they can keep pushing people around. She's done enough harm already." Reluctantly, Ethan allowed Connie and Henry Delacroix to raise the matter with the rest of the HOA board in a private session. They explained the suspicious timing, Karen's known disdain for the ramp, and the half-shredded pages. No one could conclusively prove Karen was responsible, but the board members looked grimly convinced. Some suggested having a quiet talk with her, warning that if it happened again, they'd involve law enforcement. Henry Delacroix, accompanied by Connie, arranged to sit down with Karen at the community clubhouse after hours. Karen arrived wearing a pressed blouse and a frown, obviously unhappy about being summoned. They found an empty room usually used for small gatherings, with foldable chairs around a modest table. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed. Henry wasted no time. "Karen, we wanted to discuss the recent incident with Ethan's ramp. We know you disapproved of it. And there was that sabotage with shredded paper." Karen's cheeks grew blotchy. She folded her arms. "You have no evidence," she said coldly. "I'd never do something so petty or dangerous." Connie calmly replied, "We've seen you carrying shredded paper around, Karen. We know how you felt about that ramp. We're not here to start a witch hunt, but we need you to understand the gravity of what happened." Karen's lips trembled slightly. For a moment, it looked like she might break down or admit something. Instead, she stiffened her posture. "I won't be spoken to like this," she snapped. "I have every right to shred my own documents. And I haven't touched that ramp, nor do I plan to. I'm leaving." With that, she stood and stormed out. Connie and Henry exchanged a long, weary look. The conversation had gone nowhere. Henry rubbed his temples. "We can't force a confession, but if she does anything else, I'm all for contacting the police." Connie agreed. They both felt unsettled, aware that the sabotage might not be the last act in Karen's twisted crusade. Despite Karen's refusal to admit fault, the incident continued to spur changes in the neighborhood. The updated HOA bylaws regarding accessibility passed with overwhelming support, guaranteeing that no future Karen could interfere with a homeowner's adaptive modifications. The HOA even created a small accessibility committee, which Ethan joined. Their goal was to help anyone needing ramps, railings, or other aids. They'd coordinate with local contractors and even arrange group discounts for improvements, from wheelchair ramps to handrails and bathrooms. The shredded paper attack became a cautionary tale. Residents used it to teach their kids about empathy and inclusion, how a single malicious act could endanger someone's health. Ironically, the sabotage amplified Ethan's independence. Not only was his ramp more resilient, but the neighbors grew more attuned to his needs, offering to pick up groceries or help with errands. He didn't want to become the focus of constant pity, but he appreciated the spirit of community that emerged from adversity. Over time, Karen's social isolation deepened. People waved politely, but no longer stopped to chat. She rarely attended the monthly neighborhood gatherings. Rumors spread that she was focusing on a new real estate venture outside sunny Hillside Village, possibly looking for a way out. Even her seat on the HOA board seemed uncertain. Some members quietly expressed that she should step down, given how she tarnished the HOA's reputation. A rare moment of vulnerability came when Karen was seen quietly crying in her car outside the local grocery store. A passerby recognized her and later mentioned it to Connie, who felt a pang of sympathy. Maybe she's under stress, Connie admitted. Still doesn't excuse endangering Ethan, though. Ethan himself had mixed feelings. While he harbored anger, he couldn't help but wonder about Karen's personal life. He knew that people who lash out often have unaddressed pain of their own. Nonetheless, the sabotage could have left him seriously injured. Forgiveness was possible, but trust was another matter entirely. One cloudy morning, Ethan went out to get the mail. He noticed faint streaks across the ramp's top landing, as if someone had dragged a dirty cloth across it. Worry gnawed at him. Was it more sabotage? He summoned Connie, who examined the marks and concluded they were likely from a muddy shoe. Still, it raised Ethan's anxiety. Was Karen or someone else testing if they could cause trouble again? Connie suggested installing a small camera overlooking the ramp, if only for peace of mind. Ethan agreed, though it saddened him to realize he needed surveillance in a community that was supposed to be friendly. A local technician mounted a compact camera discreetly above the porch. The sense of relief was palpable. Any new attempt to sabotage the ramp would be recorded. Word got around quickly, probably deterring further acts of vandalism. Meanwhile, Karen wasn't done stirring up tension in smaller ways. She left anonymous notes on some neighbors' doorsteps, complaining about overgrown shrubs, unsightly doormats, or a small crack in the driveway. Those who received them recognized the tone as pure Karen, controlling, haughty, and borderline harassing. However, times had changed. No one was afraid of her official authority anymore. One by one, recipients simply ignored the notes or tossed them out. A couple of them posted about the notes on the neighborhood's social media group, mocking the petty criticisms. Karen was losing her grip over the community's sense of compliance. While these small acts of defiance didn't directly threaten Ethan's ramp, they reminded everyone that Karen wasn't about to vanish quietly. She still had a need to meddle. But the difference now was that the neighborhood rallied around each other, refusing to be cowed. By summer's end, the new anti-slip treatment on Ethan's ramp had proven itself through rain and occasional storms. The reflective strips glowed reassuringly under porch lights. In an odd twist of fate, the sabotage had led to an even safer ramp, complete with improvements that might not have happened otherwise. Ethan sometimes joked that, had he known sabotage would lead to free improvements, he would have teased Karen months earlier. But behind the humor, he knew he'd narrowly avoided a severe accident. Other neighbors began considering accessible features, even if they weren't currently needed. The idea was to future-proof their homes for aging or possible injuries. It's about universal design, Henry said, making our neighborhood open to everyone. They planned a workshop on simple accessibility modifications, lever-style door handles, bathroom grab bars, sensor lights that could help older residents or those with disabilities. Thus, the entire community was evolving. The shredded paper incident, as folks called it, became a turning point. People asked new questions. How can we ensure all residents, regardless of mobility, feel welcome and safe? What steps must the HOA take to remove barriers? Suddenly, the aesthetic uniformity that Karen once championed felt empty compared to these more profound goals. The restlessness in Karen's life manifested in a for sale sign that appeared in her front yard one crisp autumn morning. She had decided to put her house on the market. Neighbors noticed the sign and parted ways in their reactions. Some were relieved, hoping her departure would bring peace. Others felt an odd pity, seeing the once dominant HOA figure forced out by her own unpopularity. Connie felt a swirl of conflicting emotions. She recalled how Karen used to be more sociable in the early days, strict but not malicious. Something had changed over the years, perhaps triggered by personal struggles. Still, you couldn't sabotage a ramp and expect the community to cheer for you. In a final act of defiance, Karen tried to slip a proposal into the HOA's monthly bulletin. She wrote an article about preserving uniformity that subtly criticized unattractive external additions. Henry spotted the article and promptly vetoed it. "We're not going backward," he told the other board members. "Not after all we've accomplished." The day Karen moved out was unexpectedly quiet. A single moving truck arrived, hauling away her furniture and dozens of boxes. She supervised grimly, wearing dark sunglasses. A couple of passers-by nodded politely, but no one stopped to chat or lend a hand. She locked the front door for the last time and left the key under the doormat for her realtor. From his window, Ethan noticed the truck pulling away. He felt a twinge of relief that this negative force was leaving. Yet a small, compassionate part of him couldn't help but wish things had gone differently, that Karen might have learned empathy instead of letting resentment consume her. Even as she drove off, Karen never rolled down the window to wave goodbye. She left sunny hillside village without ceremony, taking with her the bitterness that had once threatened to overshadow the sense of community. The irony remained. In her attempt to sabotage a wheelchair ramp, she had sparked a neighborhood-wide movement for accessibility and inclusion. With Karen gone, the neighborhood felt lighter. The once looming threat of petty rule enforcement had faded. The new HOA leadership, spearheaded by Henry Delacroix, embraced a balanced approach. Modest uniformity, yes, but also personal freedom and necessary accommodations for health or disability. They updated the community rulebook with plain, welcoming language, encouraging creative solutions that honored the spirit of sunny hillside village. Ethan felt a renewed sense of confidence. He joined the accessibility committee in a more active role, helping to create a pamphlet that explained the rights of disabled residents and offered design inspiration for ramps, handrails, and other modifications. His own ramps served as a showpiece. Neighbors would drop by, analyzing the reflective strips and anti-slip texture, eager to replicate those features should the need ever arise. One lingering worry was whether Karen's house would be bought by another mini Karen who loved rigid uniformity. But those fears dissolved when the new owners, a young couple with a toddler, arrived. They introduced themselves to Ethan and Connie almost immediately, smiling widely. The wife mentioned her mother sometimes used a cane and might visit often, so the idea of having an accessibility-friendly neighborhood appealed to them. It was a poetic circle of sorts. The features that Karen hated were exactly what attracted more open-minded neighbors. Over time, the couple even built a small rail in their foyer for the grandmother's occasional visits. No one in the HOA batted an eye. Times had changed, and so had the bylaws. Months passed, and the memory of the shredded paper sabotage grew dimmer. Some older folks in the neighborhood still mentioned it as a cautionary tale about how far resentment could go if left unchecked. But the real legacy was the improved sense of unity. People helped each other more freely, overcame petty differences, and recognized the value of building a community that welcomed everyone. Ethan, for his part, sometimes experienced flashbacks to the moment his wheelchair slipped on that wet paper. He'd feel a surge of fear imagining the tumble. Therapy and a strong support system helped him cope. He vowed to stay vigilant, but refused to give in to paranoia. Each day, rolling down the ramp became an act of quiet triumph, a reminder that he was still here, that the ramp was stronger than ever, and that kindness had prevailed over malice. As the seasons turned, the HOA hosted its first-ever community accessibility fair. Stalls were set up along the neighborhood's main park, offering demonstrations on easy home modifications, from slip-resistant flooring to voice-activated lights. Vendors showcased adjustable closet rods, Braille house number plaques, and other inclusive design elements. Ethan gave a short speech, reflecting on what had happened. "A year ago, I was the victim of a sabotage that could have ended badly for me. But look how far we've come. Our houses are now safer, and our hearts are more open to the idea that everyone, regardless of ability, deserves the freedom to live comfortably. Applause rippled through the small crowd. The fair was a success, attracting visitors from outside sunny Hillside Village. Some neighboring HOAs even asked for tips on drafting accessibility-friendly policies. Everyone recognized the importance of moving beyond the antiquated mindset that ramps or other adaptive features somehow hurt property values. In fact, many real estate agents pointed out that the opposite was true. Communities known for accessibility often attracted a broader range of buyers. Several months after Karen's departure, Ethan received a plain, white envelope in his mailbox. The return address was from a small town in another state. Inside, there was a short typed letter. "Ethan, I'm writing to express my regret for how I acted. Things spiraled out of control, and I couldn't face the shame in person. I hope your ramp is well, and I hope you know I never intended to harm you. I was lost in my own frustrations and took them out in a reprehensible way. Brenda Arwood Karen." Ethan reread the note multiple times. The tone was subdued, hinting at remorse. No direct confession of sabotage, but it felt close. A swirl of emotions overtook him: anger, relief, pity, and a bit of closure. He showed Connie, who said, "Well, that's something." Not exactly an apology to the whole neighborhood, but it's a start. Ethan chose not to reply. He needed no further entanglement with Karen, but at least he found a measure of peace in the knowledge that she acknowledged her wrongdoing, if only indirectly. Life in sunny Hillside Village carried on, evolving in the way small communities do when residents take charge of their environment and values. The wheelchair ramp that once was singled out as an eyesore now stood as a symbol of collective growth. Children who rode their bikes on the sidewalk treated it as a fixture, an accepted part of the street's landscape. Seniors who watched from their porches felt comforted knowing that if they ever needed a similar ramp, the neighborhood wouldn't just allow it, they'd support it wholeheartedly. Ethan continued his research work, balancing it with volunteer efforts in local organizations that champion disability rights. When he wasn't busy, he rolled through the neighborhood, waving at familiar faces. Occasionally, he'd see a new ramp under construction at another house, or a family installing safety grips along a walkway. Each improvement was a testament to the transformation spurred by the sabotage that had once threatened his independence. On the anniversary of the day the shredded paper was discovered, Ethan woke early. He rolled onto the ramp, pausing to absorb the morning sun. The yellow reflective strips gleamed, the anti-slip coating still intact. He thought of how something meant to break him had instead bolstered an entire community's resolve. In truth, the sabotage had forced the neighborhood to confront what truly mattered, forging a safe, inclusive space over petty aesthetic concerns. People had realized that a ramp was not a sign of negativity or lowered property values, but a beacon of practicality and empathy. And ironically, the sabotage had drawn so much attention that the ramp now looked even better and safer than before. Ethan took a moment to close his eyes, feeling gratitude for those who had stood by him: Connie, Henry, and the many neighbors who had lugged a shop vac to clear away that mess. In that act of unity, they'd shown that fear and hatred could never overshadow the simpler, stronger light of kindness. Another year passed, and sunny Hillside Village welcomed new families, said goodbye to some older ones, and adapted with the changing times. The Accessibility Committee thrived, often coordinating with local nonprofits to donate ramps or lifts to residents in need. The memory of Karen's sabotage lingered as a narrative, shared over backyard barbecues, sometimes joked about as the bizarre turning point that launched a neighborhood revolution. But the deeper lesson remained. Controlling, aggressive behaviors ultimately fail in a community that values empathy. Where Karen had tried to undermine one resident's independence, she had unintentionally inspired an entire suburban block to champion inclusivity. The last vestiges of her presence evaporated in time, overshadowed by the lasting improvements she had provoked. Ethan's ramp became a centerpiece in local tours that showcased how to integrate accessible design without compromising curb appeal. People visited from other neighborhoods to see the reflective strips and the anti-slip texture. They'd chat with Ethan, who'd graciously explain each feature, beams of pride in his eyes. Sunny Hillside Village was never a utopia. No place is. Occasional disputes over fence heights or paint colors still arose, but nothing escalated like the sabotage of Ethan's ramp. The new HOA guidelines protected the rights of those who needed modifications to their homes. The sense of fairness and cooperation grew stronger with each passing season. Connie sometimes teased Ethan that he should run for HOA president, to which he'd grin and say, "Let's not get too carried away." Yet, in a way, he already held a position of leadership. Friends and neighbors knew they could turn to him for advice, for a level-headed perspective, for an empathetic ear. In quiet moments, Ethan would recall the horrifying slip on the ramp, the fear that shot through him, the possibility of a catastrophic fall. Then he'd glance at the shining ramp that now welcomed him each day with renewed promise. He'd remember how the neighbors vacuumed every scrap of shredded paper, how they lined the ramp with reflectors and grip tape, how they refused to bow to intimidation. And a warm sense of contentment would fill him, knowing that in the face of cruelty, the best of humanity had stepped forward, and that was worth more than any uniform lawn or strict aesthetic code. Because in a place where even a single ramp can speak volumes about compassion and resilience, one meddlesome Karen was no match for the unstoppable kindness of an entire community.